Good evening. This is Forum Daily for Tuesday, January 3rd. I'm Nathaniel Dueck, filling in for Nima Rajan. Tonight, Beijing is criticizing COVID testing requirements on passengers arriving from China and threatening countermeasures against countries involved. The Foreign Ministry spokesperson said today that China believes the entry restrictions adopted by some countries, including Canada, starting this Thursday, lack scientific basis and are being manipulated for political purposes. China abruptly eased strict antivirus measures in December. It has since seen a surge in cases. Starting Thursday, Canada will require a negative COVID test taken within 2 days of departure from airline passengers in mainland China, Hong Kong, or Macau. Sunwing says it has completed all of its scheduled recovery flights to bring passengers home who were stranded in Mexico after winter storms disrupted its operations during the holidays. The travel company says in a statement that its teams have worked around the clock to get affected customers home. Some travelers from Saskatchewan say the airline has left them at airports in other provinces, while one says her flight from Mexico made it to Regina with dozens of empty seats. Sunwing announced last week that it was suspending flights from the Saskatoon and Regina airports for a month due to extenuating circumstances. Turning now to the latest in the Rogers-Shaw takeover bid. The Federal Court of Appeal has issued a temporary suspension of the Competition Tribunal's decision in dismissing its case against Rogers' $26 billion takeover of Shaw until the regulator's application for a stay and an injunction can be heard. In seeking its appeal, the regulator says the tribunal made fundamental errors of law. The Bureau had argued that the merger of the two telecommunications companies would lessen competition, trigger higher prices, and lead to a worsening of service. Meanwhile, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives says Canada's 100 highest-paid CEOs made an average of $14.3 million in 2021, smashing the previous record of $11.8 million set in 2018. Report author and senior economist David McDonald says the 100 CEOs, who are mostly men, made 243 times the average Canadian worker's salary in 2021, again beating 2018's record of 227 times. Most of the money those CEOs made was not from their salary, but from so-called variable compensation, which includes bonuses, stock options, and shares. A global ransomware operator has issued an unprecedented apology and offered to unlock data targeted in a ransomware attack on Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children. Lockbit, a ransomware group the US FBI has called one of the world's most active and destructive, issued the brief apology December 31st, what experts say is the dark web page where it posts about its ransoms and data leaks. Lockbit claims to have blocked the partner responsible for the attack and offered sick kids a free decryptor to unlock its data. One of the anti-government protest groups behind the so-called Freedom Convoy demonstrations last year has called off its plans to restage the event in Winnipeg this February. James Botter, who founded Canada Unity, said in December he would bring a 4-day event back to Ottawa. However, after police there indicated they would have zero tolerance for such an event, Mr. Botter said he would move it to Winnipeg instead. He has now called that off too. In a news release posted to the group's Facebook page, he blamed non-specific security breaches and personal attacks. Well, back in Ottawa, a 19-year-old man has been arrested for allegedly posting threatening tweets targeted at Parliament Hill, the Department of National Defense, and 2 embassies. RCMP say they were notified on November 8th of what they're calling terrorism-related threats and death threats by a Twitter user. Police say Daniel Hood allegedly targeted embassies of the United States and the People's Republic of China in Ottawa. Mr. Hood has been released on unspecified conditions and is set to appear in court on January 18th. Team Canada had a day off today at the World Junior Championship ahead of Wednesday's semifinal match with the United States. Canada advanced with a 4-3 overtime win over Slovakia last night. Connor Bedard scored the winner and became Canada's all-time leading scorer at the tournament. The Americans were 11-1 winners over Germany. Czechia meets Sweden in tomorrow's other semifinal. And scientists studying the endangered North Atlantic right whale are cautiously optimistic about the current breeding season after 9 calves were spotted during the first few weeks. Moira Brown, senior scientist with the Canadian Whale Institute, says fewer than 100 of the 340 surviving animals in the waters along Canada's eastern coast are mothers. Dr. Brown says recent seasons has seen the lack of first-time mothers, which supports research showing a downward trend in the number of females capable of breeding. Well, when we return from the break, we'll take a look at how paramedics across the country fared during the major winter storm that hit the country over the holiday period. Stay tuned. Forum Daily will be right back after a short break. Stay with us. The president of the Ontario Paramedic Association says that paramedic services were working at full levels across the province on December 23rd. This when the province was hit the hardest by the snowstorm that swept across Canada and the U.S. ahead of the holidays. It forced Canadians across the country to deal with flash freezing conditions, power outages, and the cancellation of their holiday travel plans. Emergency responders across the country were forced to navigate whiteout conditions, avalanche warnings, road closures, and car crashes, leading to an influx in 911 calls on top of the usual demand. With us to discuss what paramedics across Canada experienced during the storm this holiday season is Mr. Deines, president of the Paramedic Association of Canada. Mr. Deines, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So, can you just tell us a bit about some of the conditions and events that paramedics across the country faced this holiday season?
Yeah, thanks. And so, as you mentioned in the story, they're similar to the conditions in Ontario. Paramedics from coast to coast to coast were dealing with severe winter conditions that not only impacted, obviously, our ability to respond, but also increased the demand on 911 services. So, made it extremely difficult over the holiday season.
Where this is Canada, we've had snowstorms before, but this one was particularly impactful in a lot of ways. So, how does this snowstorm compare to others in Canada in terms of impacting paramedics and ambulance services?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we're no strangers to winter conditions in Canada, but certainly this was much more severe. And if you look at places like the West Coast or the lower mainland in British Columbia, they're not used to dealing with those types of conditions. So not only the amount of snow and the need to remove it, but also the bone chilling conditions. I think anybody that's watched the news saw what happened to our major airport here at Vancouver International, as well as it impacts the ability for our paramedics to actually get into the workplace as well. So it's a compounding problem for sure in jurisdictions that aren't used to either the amount of snow that falls or the chilly conditions for sure.
That's an interesting point. Not used to weather patterns. So, have changing weather patterns across the country have they impacted paramedic services as well across the country? West Coast, East Coast, Central Canada, prairies.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know, for example, again in British Columbia, we were hit with several extreme weather events. The last being the snow winter storm, but also the flooding event in November, and then the extreme heat dome in the summer of 2021. So kind of it's been an emerging theme, particularly on the West Coast, but also with the severe winter storm now that's hit central and eastern Canada. So we're definitely seeing more and more weather events that are impacting the ability of paramedics and paramedic services to respond to patients, not only just in the traditional means of we can't get through because roads haven't been cleared, but again, those things that impact the ability for paramedics to even just get to work.
Let's build off that point that you just mentioned there. So, weather aside, what are some of the major issues paramedics are facing in calls across the country now?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, so as we know, there's lots of jurisdictions in Canada that have had a dramatic increase in demand on the service, either from the opiate or the COVID pandemic, but also the triple pandemic that's happening now in a lot of places in Canada with RSV, influenza, and COVID. So that in itself in isolation is putting a huge demand on paramedic resources and paramedics. And then anything you put on top of that that impacts the ability for paramedics to actually respond just drives that stress level and that inability up onto a system that's almost at its breaking point on any given day.
You mentioned breaking point there. So, what actually is the state of staffing levels across the country?
Yeah, it's fairly dire. Most paramedic services in Canada are seeing severe staffing shortages, and that's either from the inability to recruit paramedics or because paramedics themselves are injured or ill. We know a very high percentage of paramedics in Canada that are suffering from mental health illness and injury as a result of dealing with the call volume and the large request for help over the last 3 years, for example. So there's a whole kind of perfect storm going on right now in terms of human resources and paramedic services that definitely need to be addressed.
Quick 30 seconds, but how can officials and authorities address these issues and response times, staffing, and mental health?
Yeah, certainly, in 30 seconds, it's a very complex issue and multi-pronged, but definitely the need to increase recruitment and retention with paramedic staff and services. So the traditional ways in doing that, incentives, wages, all those types of things will definitely help, but also recruitment drives, talking about how paramedics can be utilized in non-traditional roles. So for example, being utilized as community paramedics in jurisdictions that help mitigate the demand on the regular emergency fleet will help as well.
Mr. Dave Deines, thank you for joining us today on Forum Daily.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We'll be right back after the break, and when we return, we'll be taking a look at the major news stories and headlines from across the United States. Stay with us, Forum Daily. We'll be right back. Buffalo defensive back Damar Hamlin remains in critical condition after the Bills say his heart stopped following a tackle during the Monday night football game, which was postponed indefinitely. Damar Hamlin collapsed on the field during the first quarter of the nationally televised game against the Cincinnati Bengals and was given medical treatment for nearly 20 minutes before being taken to a hospital. His heartbeat was restored on the field, and he was transferred to the UC Medical Center for further testing and treatment. He is currently sedated and listed in critical condition. Some of his teammates have been unwilling to return to Buffalo just so they can remain close to him. U.S. House Republicans are courting chaos on the opening day of the new Congress. Republican leader Kevin McCarthy has fallen short in 2 rounds of voting to become House Speaker. He is the first House Speaker nominee in 100 years to fail to win the gavel with their party in majority. It's in stark contrast with the other side of the U.S. Capitol, where Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell became the longest-serving party leader in Senate history, while Democrat Chuck Schumer will remain as majority leader. A man facing first-degree murder charges in the slayings of 4 University of Idaho students in November has waived his rights to an extradition hearing today in Pennsylvania. 28-year-old Brian Koberger was taken into custody early Friday by state police at his parents' home in eastern Pennsylvania. His lawyer said Mr. Koberger is eager to be exonerated of the stabbings and should be presumed innocent. Authorities say 5 guns were recovered from a man shot and killed by police after a chase and gunfire that killed a western Pennsylvania police chief and wounded 2 other officers. The police chief and another officer were shot blocks apart Monday in Brackenridge. The suspect was later shot and killed in Pittsburgh. State Attorney General and Governor-elect Josh Shapiro said slain Brackenridge Police Chief Justin McIntyre ran towards danger to keep Pennsylvanians safe, and he made the ultimate sacrifice. The second officer was in stable condition with a leg wound, and a third officer was hit by suspected shrapnel. 22 people were hurt in a hit-and-run in New York City after one car rear-ended another and sent it crashing into a restaurant last night. Police say a white Audi exited a gas station and rear-ended a Toyota SUV. The SUV mounted the curb and crashed into the front window of the Inwood Bar and Grill. 19 people were taken to hospitals. Well, the annual tech industry event, formerly known as the Consumer Electronics Show, is returning to Las Vegas this week, with the hope that it looks more like it did before the coronavirus pandemic. The show changed its name to CES several years ago to better reflect the changing industry and the event, which had expanded beyond the audio and video to include automotive, digital health, smartphones, wearables, and other technologies. Companies and startups will showcase innovations in virtual reality, robotics, and consumer tech items to the media and others in the tech industry. The show is not open to the general public. Organizers say their goal is to draw 100,000 attendees. Well, Tesla says it sold a record 1.3 million electric vehicles last year. But the number fell short of CEO Elon Musk's pledge to grow the company's sales by 50% nearly every year. The figure topped the prior record of 936,000 vehicles delivered in 2021. Sales grew 40% year over year. On other tech-related news, drone advances in Ukraine have accelerated a technology trend which could soon bring the world's first fully autonomous robots to the battlefield and inaugurate a new age of warfare. Experts say it may only be a matter of time before Russia, Ukraine, or both deploy drones programmed to find and attack targets without help from humans. This would mark a revolution in military technology as profound as the introduction of the machine gun. Turning now to new U.S. research, which is bolstering the theory that nearly all of us should be drinking more water. Research from a branch of the National Institutes of Health looked at sodium levels in the bloodstream, found that higher levels were associated with heart failure, stroke, diabetes, and dementia. The study also suggests that boosting the amount of water you consume through food and drink can help to keep your biological age from exceeding your chronological age. And flower-covered floats and marching bands celebrated the new year as California's 134th Rose Parade slipped through a gap in a siege of drenching storms. Pasadena's annual floral spectacle offers the optimistic theme of turning the corner for 2023. Former U.S. Congresswoman Gabby Giffords of Arizona, who survived being shot in 2011, served as Grand Marshal. Downpours pounded Southern California over the weekend and spared the parade, but then returned last night during the Rose Bowl college football game that saw Penn State beat Utah. Forum Daily will be right back after the break with a look at the major headlines and news stories from around the world. Stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back shortly. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia is preparing to step up its attacks on Ukraine using more Iranian-made exploding drones. Moscow is looking for ways to keep up the pressure on Kyiv after months of battlefield setbacks, including the deaths of at least 63 soldiers in one Ukrainian attack on New Year's Day. Mr. Zelensky said Monday night that Ukraine has information that Russia is planning a prolonged attack by exploding drones as it tries to break Ukraine's resistance 11 months into Russia's invasion. Meanwhile, South Korea has reconfirmed that Seoul and Washington are discussing its involvement in U.S. nuclear asset management, as to cope with intensifying North Korean nuclear threats. The South Korean presidential office's statement came after U.S. President Joe Biden denied that the allies were discussing joint nuclear exercises. A spokesperson for South Korea's president reconfirmed the discussions today. In the UK, commuters returning to work after the Christmas break are advised not to travel, as tens of thousands of rail workers in the UK stage a fresh round of strikes that will disrupt services all week. About half of the UK's railway lines are closed, and only 1/5 of services are running amid a long-running dispute over pay and working conditions. Many places, including most of Scotland and Wales, have no train services. Strikes are part of wider labor unrest in the UK that has seen nurses and ambulance drivers walking off their jobs in December to demand higher pay. Official data show that inflation in Turkey slowed in December thanks to a favorable base effect. The development could help President Erdogan's standings ahead of elections, but is unlikely to bring relief to households suffering from a cost of living crisis. The Turkish Statistical Institute said Tuesday that consumer prices for the year rose by 64% in December, down from 84% reported in November. It's the second month in a row that inflation has eased after hitting a 24-year high of 85.5% in October. Moving to Germany, where the first regular shipment of liquefied natural gas from the United States has arrived to help the country replace energy supplies it previously received from Russia. The tanker vessel Maria Energy arrived at the North Sea port of Wilhelmshaven, where its shipment of LNG will be converted back into gas. Germany has rushed to find a replacement for Russian gas supplies following its invasion of Ukraine. Shifting to Africa, where a rights group in Burkina Faso has charged that volunteer militia groups supporting the army have killed dozens of civilians in the ethnic Fulani group, including children in the country's troubled west. Dauda Diallo is the executive secretary of the civic group, the Collective Against Impunity and Stigmatization of Communities. He said Tuesday that military supporters killed nearly 30 civilians last week in Nuna town, a predominantly Fulani and Muslim community. Burkina Faso's Fulani people have been increasingly targeted by the military and local defense militias. This because they are suspected of supporting the West African country's Islamist extremist rebels. They have been inflicting violence on the country for years. Pakistan's foreign minister has issued an emotional appeal ahead of a major conference next week. He is urging the international community to generously donate funds for the country's flood victims. Gathering in Geneva, jointly hosted by the United Nations and Pakistan, aims to raise funds for the victims of last year's unprecedented flooding, which experts partly attribute to climate change. At one point, a third of Pakistan's territory was underwater. While public viewing continued in Vatican City today for tens of thousands more faithful who want to pay their respects to Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. The retired Pope's body is laying in state in St. Peter's Basilica, where 12 hours of viewing has been set for today and tomorrow before Thursday's funeral. 65,000 visitors filed past his body yesterday. Well, 45 years after Pelé played his last game, the Brazilian soccer great was buried today in the city of Santos. It is where he grew up, got famous, and helped turn into a global soccer capital. Pelé died Thursday at age 82 after a battle with cancer. He was the only player ever to win 3 World Cups. The Catholic Mass was celebrated at the Vila Belmiro Stadium before Pelé's casket was ushered through the streets of Santos to a cemetery. Meanwhile, a video of what appears to be a giant Pacific octopus in the waters of British Columbia has been seen millions of times on social media. Brooke Satter of Port Alberni, BC, says the octopus was found clinging to the side of one of her family's prawn traps in late December. Ms. Satter says the more than 2-meter-long animal stayed on the trap for 2 to 3 minutes before swimming away. Her video had more than 41 million views on TikTok as of Monday afternoon. Well, I'm Nathaniel Dueck, filling in for Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Thanks for watching.